everyone? How we doing today? Dr. Dale here, coming into you from North Central College in my office. Very much enjoying working here in my new position. But today we're going to have a pretty interesting discussion with one of, I think, the foremost experts about Rapa Nui history. Not only a good colleague, but a solid friend. It's an honor to introduce Cristián Moreno Pakarati. What's up, big dog? How you doing today?
Cool, really good. Rainy day, but yeah, really looking forward for this conversation.
So right now, CMP, as I call him in all of my notes, he's coming to us from Rapa Nui. So this is an outstanding mix. We're basically almost 5,000 miles apart from each other. But here we are able to use all of our modern technology to have a discussion. Our focus today is really about 300 years of contact. So as we know, Rapa Nui was first colonized by the Polynesians, maybe between 1200 AD or current era. And the island was dominated by a very complex socio-political organization led by Polynesian chiefs and elites. However, the island was discovered by the Europeans April 5th, 1722. So we are commemorating some 300 years of Rapa Nui being in the larger globalized world. And I just figure I'd start out by asking our master historian, what does this mean 300 years after the Dutch arrived to the island in their 3 ships? What does that mean to you as a historian? What does that mean to you as a Rapa Nui expert? Why don't you fill us in on some of that?
Well, I think that it's quite an important event. It was definitely something that shattered many things, many beliefs probably, that led to a change in a way of thinking that the Rapa Nui people have. I'm sure I know there are lots of interpretations of this event, modern interpretations of this event, of the arrival of these ships. One could say that materially speaking, the Dutch visit was not that important. As you know, they stayed only 4 hours on land. They spent most of the time in the ships, like navigating around and like trying to figure out whether this island was part of the mythical Southland or southern continent in the Pacific, the Terra Australis. And when they realized it wasn't that, and that the island had nothing of real value for them, right? Gold or whatever, right? They said, okay, well, we leave and let's continue searching for what we're looking for. So materially speaking, the Dutch visit was not that much important. Of course, yeah, there was an incident where they shot islanders and some Rapa Nui fell down and were killed, right? But other than that, what's the real impact? It's the fact that it broke the cycle. Rapa Nui people had the Rapa Nui people, Polynesians, as you know, well, you're of course aware that Polynesians are were very, very scientific minded. They studied birds, they studied stars, they studied the cycles of life very well. And they had their own ideas. They mixed it up with spirituality, religion, whatever, right? But they studied these things very thoroughly. So they knew their cycles very well. They knew, of course, the shortest cycle, day and night. Okay, that's really predictable, day and night. They had names for the different times of the day, different times of the night. Then you have a lunar cycle, the moon, right? The moon, 28 nights or 29, right? So they knew them very well. And then after the moon cycle, which is about a month, you have the year, the cycle of the seasons, you could say. Sure. The seasons, right? The Tonga and Hora, the summer, warm season and slightly colder season, as this is a subtropical island, right?
Yes.
Or dry season and wet season. And then you have the longer cycles, even longer than that. The year, solar cycle, the sun, for how it moves from solstice to solstice, right? And then finally, cycles that could be longer that the islanders were aware. For example, the Enzo oscillation, El Nino Southern oscillation. I'm sure that they had some notion of it, right? Because after living on this island for hundreds of years, I'm sure they were aware how that affected rainfall, how that affected dry periods, and so on. So everything was predictable for them. Any expert, any tohunga could say, all right, in 3 days, we will have Matariki, the seven sisters, the Pleiades, appear in the sky near the horizon for the first time after 3 months, right? And you would go there that night and that would happen. Or any tohunga could tell you, next, I don't know, in 5 days from now, the Manutara will land in Motunui. And well, 5 days later, you go there and the Manutara arrive and land in Motunui. So they know perfectly when things will happen, right? They know the solstice, they know the equinox, they know all of these things. But there's this one thing that was completely unpredictable, and that's the arrival of foreign ships after hundreds of years, because we know Polynesia was connected at some point with this island, maybe. It's something that still is discussed, but we know that by the late 1300s, or let's say 1400s, no one was coming to this island anymore. So the fact that ships arrive all of a sudden, it breaks the cycle. And that is April the 5th, Easter Sunday, 1722 for Europeans, which is the fall here. It's at the fall, right in the middle of the fall. And then I am sure that after everything that happened here on April the 5th of 1723, Gregorian calendar, I'm sure the Rapa Nui were up there in Poike watching the horizon, trying to determine whether this was going to be another annual cycle. But nothing happened, right? And then, well, when is it going to happen again, right? And it doesn't happen again till 48 years later. But it's strange because when the Spanish came in 1770, that's November of 1770. So that is the spring. That's the spring of 1770. And then 4 years later, Captain Cook, that's March, that's late summer of 1774. And then 12 years later, the French, 1786, there's no pattern. Right. It just happens. Right. And the Rapa Nui have no control over it, right? So that's what I think is the real impact of the Dutch expedition for the Rapa Nui people.
I think that's an interesting point. Just to go back a little bit about those cycles, I would also think they have an understanding too of the pelagic fish and when tuna are coming back and fish in the oceans. We've talked a lot about, just the geological timelines. You're always interested in the volcanic eruptions. That maybe have been something that was a little bit, we know there's these larger events that no Rapa Nui saw volcanic activity on the island, but there was definitely events that would have got to Rapa Nui, like more recently after the Tonga sort of earthquake and eruption that I believe you guys had the most spectacular sunsets, and because you have all this ash and this material that was there. Tailing onto that, the idea about Cook, when Cook came his second time around Hawaii, that's what got him in trouble, because he came out of cycle. Probably brought him to his death. So we could see that some of these Polynesians, they were really at times strict with their calendars, because they had to plant at a certain time and harvest and worship the ancestors. So you can imagine just how much perhaps disruption this random event would be. So I think that's a really great way to sort of start off. Can you just talk a little bit more? Why were the Dutch coming into the Pacific here? What were some of their goals, and what was the route they took? Did they see other Pacific islands? Did they stop at other places?
Yeah, Well, this is the age of empire, of course, and the Dutch were challenging the Spanish and the British and the French in the Pacific, right? They had powerful fleets. Those were the naval powers, right? The British, the Dutch, and the French, and the Spanish were a little bit on the decline by then.
Right.
I would say that the first European decision that had an effect on the Pacific Ocean was when the Pope in Rome split the world in two and said, okay, this is called the Tratado de Tordesillas, which is based on a papal, I don't know, document, the Bulla Inter Cetera. So he said, okay, since Spain and Portugal are the most Catholic and devoutly Catholic nations in the world, and they have these great navigators, we are going to decide that we're going to draw a line that's 500, I don't know, what's the unit, leguas? I don't know how they call that in English. Leagues, yeah, 500 leagues, yeah. West of some islands that now belong to Portugal, the Azores,
Okay.
in the Atlantic, right? So this half will be for Portugal, the other half would be for Spain. Now, at that time, it was not known. This is the 1400s, right? So it was not known how big the Earth was. No one had ever circumnavigated the planet. So that decision meant that the Pacific Ocean was for Spain, right? The unknown Pacific Ocean for Europeans, they didn't know it existed, but it was for Spain, right? So the Spanish went there and they colonized the Americas at first, but the continent was so big, so huge, the Spanish had their hands full. It was too much to deal with. So they forgot about exploring the rest of the Pacific. By the late 1500s, their navigation over the Pacific started to decline. They had too much to do in the Americas. In fact, North America was later relinquished, right? And central parts of the Caribbean as well. So, okay, let's leave that for the British, for other people, whatever. South America, Central America, that's enough. And then, of course, the British had their, they split up with the Catholic religion, of course, you know. They became Anglicans, right? Protestants, the same with the Dutch and the French. So they didn't care what the Pope said. If the Pope said the Pacific is for Spain, oh yeah, we'll see about that, right? So they just went to the Pacific to challenge the Spanish there. And one thing that everybody believed was that there was a huge continent that was theoretically determined to exist in the South Pacific. And that is, well, it's Antarctica, but they thought that it was not that far south. They thought it was part of the Pacific Ocean and that it had temperate climate and that it had gold and it had all sorts of stuff, whatever. So they were all looking for it, right? So it was a huge disappointment that in the 1500s, no one found it. In the 1600s, no one found it. By the 1700s, there weren't many people willing to find it. They thought, it doesn't exist, right? There's nothing there, right? So, but this guy, Roggeveen, Jacob Roggeveen, was the son of a geography nut, right? His father, Jacob Roggeveen's father, was a geek, was a nerd about geography. The guy loved this. He drew maps. He knew everything about old maps and stuff, right? So to fulfill his father's dream, when he retired from, he was a lawyer. Roggeveen was a lawyer. He was never a man of the sea. He never navigated. He didn't have a ship or anything. But he retired as a lawyer. He was able to, well, amass some money from savings he had during his life. And he was able to convince a small company, because, okay, the Dutch had two private companies that controlled the seas, right? One was the huge Dutch East India Company. And there was a much smaller one called the Dutch West India Company, right? So the Dutch West India Company was the one that Roggeveen approached and offered them to find them some extra lands to trade with. And which lands are those? Well, the mythical continent that he was going to find in the South Pacific. So he offered this continent. He said, I'm going to find it, and we will be able to trade with that continent, and then we will challenge, and we will become bigger than the Dutch East India Company that traded with Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, there were lots of spices and stuff. So the Dutch West India traded with the Caribbean, northern part of the Caribbean Sea, South America, Suriname, and that area, but not much else, right? So they approved this plan, and Roggeveen sailed, and with 3 ships, he needed to hire people, of course, hire captains of ships and crew members and stuff. So about 200 people or something, 220 approximately, set sail in 3 ships, small wooden ships sailing. So they traveled across the Atlantic, went around Cape Horn, and then went north, parallel to the coast of Chile, and then all the way across the Pacific, searching for this continent. They found this island, of course, just by sheer luck, by chance. Okay, they found it after probably 100 and something attempts or 100 and something crossings of the Pacific Ocean.
Wow.
Finally, someone found this island. And he also found a few other places. He was the first one at Bora Bora in Tahiti. He was the first one in Samoa as well. First European in Samoa. Yeah, but that was later. That was after they lost a ship. One of the 3 ships was lost in the Tuamotu Islands, in the atoll of Takapoto.
He pulled a Heyerdahl. He pulled a Kontiki.
Yeah, and they had they still have in the Tuamotus some of the cannons that were from the wreckage. They recovered some cannons that they had. So, it was, of course, he didn't find this continent. They were looking, while they were in the Pacific, they thought that the key, the lead to find the continent, the Terra Australis, was the so-called Davis Land or Davis Island, right? Because they thought, okay, Davis Land was some place that was allegedly found by some Captain Edward Davis, who was going around the Pacific as a corsair in the Bachelor's Delight. That was the name of the ship, right? And there are 2 reports from Dampier and Wafer, 2 sailors on the ship, that mentioned that, they saw this land, but they didn't approach the land. And that it was a strange land because it was a low sandy island. But beyond that, there seemed to be like a chain of highlands and mountains that it kept going as far as the eye can see. So Roggeveen said, okay, low sandy island is there, and it signals the existence of a chain of highlands that must be the southern continent, the Terra Australis.
Right.
But this was not Davis Land, and they didn't find the continent. So, so that's pretty much the idea at that time.
Outstanding. Yeah, thank you for that. It really painted a picture of just, the man behind the mission, how he was able to organize these 3 ships. I believe one of them was the Theo Hoven, and then there's the 2 others, and I believe it's when the ship originally calls to Rapa Nui, a lot of these great Rapa Nui swimmers and small vessels called Vakaama, sort of like small outrigger canoes, not full, maybe for 2 or 3 people, are circling around these ships and trying to most likely barter, I would assume, and create interactions of prestige. But if you go to Rapa Nui, that the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to be given a gift, even in today's day and age. If you come to the island and you get off the plane in Montevideo, and usually you'll have your host, and the first thing you'll get is, a nice flowered lei as you come in there. So I would assume that practice has ancestral roots to perhaps visitors that came to the island, or even if you went from one clan to another clan and moved between the island, I would assume there were welcoming ceremonies like the Maori do and other Polynesian groups do. But what I was going to ask is, they don't originally stop and get on the island. It takes them a few days. They, just to sort of fill in the details here a little bit, but really quickly, I know that they sort of mostly focus on the west side of the island. They sort of dock more on the northern port where they come on. You say 4 hours that they're basically on the island. What did they see? What did they talk about? What was the route? And why do you think they only stayed on the island for 4 hours?
Well, they saw the island at first, and they thought, okay, that must be Davis Land, because it's okay. They didn't find it exactly at the latitude and longitude of Davis Land. There was nothing there, so they just kept going, and they moved about 12 degrees of longitude further to the west, and then there was this island. So they said, okay, maybe Davis was wrong, so maybe this is Davis Land. So they started circumnavigating it. They didn't notice the presence of people at first, but then later it became very clear when they saw the columns of smoke rising all over the south coast. Lots of columns of smoke. We can wonder, what was that? Were they just cooking? Were they just making fire because it was cold? Apparently it was relatively cold. Right now it's raining on Rapa Nui, and we know that in the account of the Dutch, they mention several times bouts of rain, showers, right? So it was pretty much the same weather that we are having now. So maybe it was that, or maybe they were just making signals for the other Rapa Nui, right? Maybe that smoke rising was a signal, right? Okay, ships are coming, something's out there in the sea, right? What's that, right? So we know there are petroglyphs of Polynesian ships. We know the petroglyphs in Papavaca. Well, you know them very well too. So I'm sure that the Rapa Nui people had preserved in their traditions the existence of ships. They mention in the oral tradition, in the traditional history, the kinds of ships that were used to get to the island by the first Polynesians that arrived here. So I'm sure that was the first comparison, right? Well, it's probably a vaca poe poe, or it's probably some kind of a ship, some kind of a vessel similar to that. But well, it's what's interesting is that the Dutch, navigated parallel to the south coast. Then they went around and they started navigating parallel to the west coast and started sounding the west coast, trying to find a safe place. But the wind changed again, and they were always unsure, right? Because the island does not have a very well sheltered bay. Everything is sort of exposed depending on where the wind comes from.
Sure.
Right? So,
and especially the west coast. That's I think one of the most brutal coasts that's there, between the stronger waves and the winds that come in there. That's no joke of that coastal area. So it makes sense. They wouldn't, if they would have kept going, they would eventually have found Anakena and Hangarao, which would have been their best bet. But it took them time, I think, to figure out where they were going to try to land. And probably I would assume they're looking for some sort of defensive position too, and not just being in the open, so they could help with their sort of Marines and people that they're sending for their landing parties.
Yeah, the Dutch had on board Marines. They had armed people, because since they were going to a new continent, they wanted to prepare a beachhead. They wanted to prepare a safe perimeter for the first colony to be settled on that place, right? And then bring reinforcements. Once they find that continent, they prepare to, okay, they will bring now more reinforcements, more people, but they needed to have armed people, right? With guns and everything. So, they seem to be quite distrusting of the people on this island, right? Or in general, of all the people that they met on these islands. Whereas the Rapa Nui people did not distrust at all the Dutch. They were quite... people, they are different, right? And they go there and let's go find out who these people are, right? But never with a kind of afraid or anything like that. So that's a very interesting difference, right? The
Right.
Dutch were always, we don't know, maybe they are they are cannibals, maybe they are, I don't know, savages, whatever, right? So that's also one thing that to me is really remarkable is that the first contact is not really a group or masses of people going out there. The first contact is a single guy described as having tattoo, described as having long ears, right? The long ears hanging from, which is well documented from many other European expeditions and well documented in the archaeological record when you look at the moai, right? So the long ears. And well, this guy alone goes out there in a very small vaca small canoe with an outrigger, rowing, right? This guy goes there and goes on board of the ship. And well, most people who have studied this contact believe that this guy was some sort of a priest or a chief, an important chief, because it seems like it's some sort of a protocol in Polynesia that when, even in archipelagos, right, you go from this island to the next island over there, you have to wait out there till someone from the island comes for you, welcomes you, and shows you the way to go to the safest place, right? So it seems like this sort of Polynesian protocol survived for several centuries until 1722, when this guy goes out there rowing and indicates to the Dutch, at some point he says, okay, over here. And the weather was changing. The sea was starting to get a little bit rough. But the ships, I mean, that's the other thing. Polynesians did not keep their ships like tied to a wharf in the sea, in the water. Polynesians just took them all the way inland, right? Over ramps. These sorts of European ships, you cannot do that with them, right? So, well, it must have been complicated logistically speaking, but I'm sure that this guy had a plan, and he started greeting the Dutch and trying to show them the way. When the Dutch did not follow him, he returned rowing again. He screamed again something or yelled something again, hey, over here or something, and started rowing back to the shore, but the Dutch did not follow him. So the guy seemed to be confused. Why were the Dutch not following him? So at some point, the Dutch realized that the sea was getting rough, and they decided to go away, and they moved towards the north coast. And that's when they move all the way around to the north coast to the area of Anakena and Hangaho'onu. My opinion is that they landed in Hangaho'onu for several reasons, but over the north coast. So that's when they realized also that the people from the island started to follow Miru district from Tahai to Anakena. People started to follow, started moving along the coast, following the ships as they moved and turned around over to the north coast. So that was also something that they noticed. And then, well, again, like moving around, getting there, and planning for a landing at some point. But that was postponed again until the 9th, I think, 9th of April, which was finally the moment when they thought it was safe for landing.
So they get there the 5th, and it still takes them 4 days basically to do the reconnaissance, to wait for the proper seas and the protocol, and then they step down on the island. They most likely had their own skiffs that they're using to push themselves forward. They have to tie off. Do we have ideas of how many people landed on the island? What was the size of the parties, and who were some of the key people that were in that scouting party?
Well, the group that landed in the end was a large group. The group of Marines was about 80 of the 220 crew members that had important armament, guns, arsenal. And the officers of the ship were also coming. The most well-known one was a German corporal from Mecklenburg called Karl Friedrich Behrens. who wrote an account. And it's the only account that was not confiscated later because, well, I'm just getting a little bit ahead, but later the Dutch expedition would be, they would go to jail in Indonesia because, well, they entered the area of the Dutch East India Company. So most of these reports, the accounts, the logs and everything were confiscated. But apparently Behrens had something, or was very eloquent to talk or something, and talk these people out of taking his log. So this is the first log that was published. And Behrens is very look at me, I'm cool in his report, right? And so yeah, he claims that when the landing party was going ashore, he ordered everybody to stay put in the boat. That was the first boat that was getting to the shore, and they stayed there. And then Behrens jumps out of the boat, goes swimming a little bit, and then he's the first one to step on this island, first European to step on the island. Now, well, whether that's true or not, well, we don't know, but he claims that in his log.
He's like the Neil Armstrong of the moon, right? He wants to be the
the
man who takes the first step, and it's a huge step for the bigger step for the Dutch, something like that.
Sure. And it's a German guy, right?
Yeah.
So it's not even a Dutch guy.
Not even a Dutch guy, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, but what's interesting is that in the Dutch had already an idea of what the Rapa Nui were like, because on the couple of days before the landing was attempted, the Rapa Nui, after noticing the failure of the emissary to bring the ships ashore, they started going out, right? So they started going in their pora, in their vaca ama, or just swimming out a mile or something to where the ships were. And went on board and traded with the Dutch and got stuff. Well, the Dutch started immediately complaining that the islanders were thieves, and, well, it's like the constant thing that is said by the crew members of different expeditions, that the islanders were stealing stuff from them, after the islanders themselves carried sweet potato, bananas, chickens, all sorts of stuff, and they were giving them to the Dutch, but the Dutch claimed that the islanders were stealing stuff from them. Well, maybe it's a way of guaranteeing a fair exchange of goods or something like that. But, well, those are the interpretations, right? And well, so the Dutch had an idea on how the Rapa Nui were. So a group remained with the boats in at the bay of Hangaho'onu. Why do I think it's Hangaho'onu? We have 3 serious reports. It's Behrens, Rogeveen's log of the ship, and Cornelis Bowman, who was the captain of one of the other ships, of the Tienhoven. So Bowman's report was published only in 1994 in the Rapa Nui Journal by Herbert von Saer, the last report that was published. And this guy found it somewhere, like in an archive somewhere. This guy mentions that to the southwest of the ship, right, where the ship was anchored, he claims that towards the southwest, so to the right of the bay, if they are in Hangaho'onu, there was a single incredibly tall statue with a red rock on top of it. That must be Moiparo. So I think that's where they anchored then, in Hangaho'onu, and Moiparo was in that direction.
Yeah.
Well, a group then stayed with the boats, taking care of the boats, because they probably had heard that in other islands, maybe some other explorers had lost some of their boats to the indigenous populations in some of these islands, right? So they were taking care of the boats. They knew that the weather could change any time. So they wanted to make sure that if it was needed, they could return to the boats and very quickly go back to the ships and get out of there, right? And another group made a well, a quick walk around the area, trying to explore, finding out about the dwellings, finding out about, well, the riches of the country, what's out there, and made those descriptions that you know very well, the descriptions about the very fertile lands, and that they were growing stuff, sweet potato, all sorts of tubers, and all sorts of uhi, taro, yams, and well, sweet potato, bananas as well. They were surprised though by the lack of trees. They saw a few. I think in one of the reports they mentioned that there were some green patches here and there of small shrubby like trees. Probably toromiro, right? It seems like toromiro is the last tree that made it all the way to the 19th century in relative abundance until the introduction of sheep, right, in the 1860s. So yeah, that's a description of the land, description of the moai, description of the ceremonies that they saw. So they see ceremonies going on still in the 1700s, 1720s. In general, a pretty good description. The people were seen as healthy, relatively strong, nimble, right, agile. So people in good health, people that were eating enough, people that had, well, they were fit and everything. So absolutely zero reasons to believe that there was some sort of a bad thing going on the island.
No collapse.
Zero reasons to believe that there was a collapse going on, or even close to a collapse, right? So they don't mention it. In fact, if you read it, it's a very favorable description, except for the fact that there weren't many trees left. The trees, right? That's the thing.
But again, yeah, they weren't on other sides to looking at other places inside, like Ranos. They're not in Abarangauca to see that might have been a palm sanctuary at the end of the times. So again, I think that that 4 hours, you know, I've spent 20 years there and I still don't know what's going on sometimes. And you always come across a new landscape or a new little micro area that you just haven't seen if you haven't been there. So, but it does make sense because, you know, these were groups that were practicing slash burn horticulture, intensive horticulture. Some fields would have been switching and moving around through time, where trees could have grown in some areas, goes fallow, they recut, and you know, there's definitely some type of forest management. Just with our time here to keep our listeners going, my last question was, what happens? There's the great discussion about, you know, the first time that Rapa Nui is seen by the outside world and vice versa. Shots are fired and Rapa Nui are killed. And I make the analogy, could we imagine that all of a sudden the aliens that moved all the statues finally come and visit us?
Yeah.
And shots are fired in a way like, you know, Mars attacks. How would we respond to the outside world afterwards? So can you paint a little picture about what is that interaction and what would end up happening afterwards?
Well, yeah, the Dutch were, it seems like, I mean, the Rapa Nui see the Dutch and they see these sticks there. Well, sticks. What is that, right? They have no clue it's a weapon, right? So the Rapa Nui are curious, and they've always been very curious people, you know, right? And you've known them for, you've known us for well, 20 years, right, or more. So very curious people, and they wanted to see and they wanted to touch these things. They wanted to see what's the metal of the thing, the metallic part, right? The wood and the metal. Oh wow, wood. If wood was a scarce commodity on the island as well. Oh wow, what is that, right? Let me see, because it's a different kind of wood. It's not toromiro. It's not makoi. What sort of wood is that, right? What sort of shiny object is that? The cannon, right, that you see there. What is that? So they wanted to touch this. They wanted to have an idea. It's like people today, tourists want to touch the moai. It's the same thing. Tourists want to touch the moai, and we say, no, don't touch them because cumulative damage and so on, right? Yeah. But well, so it's the same thing. People want to touch things. People are like, that's one of the most important senses, right? Touching. And and that's when when all hell broke loose, because some islanders said, okay, but let me just see this. I'm giving it back to you, or something like that. Of course, it was impossible to understand each other. The Dutch only spoke European languages. The Rapanui only spoke Rapanui. There was no way of communicating verbally. And in this struggle, at some point, one of the officers got afraid and ordered to shoot, to fire, right? And then, well, they just shot, and 10 or 12 islanders fell dead. And that's the first contact, man. That's the first contact with Europeans. And of course, tension started to rise, and that's probably the main reason why the Dutch returned to the ships afterwards. When Roggeveen and Bowman returned to the boats with the officers and with the rest of the group, they see this carnage, right? The scene in front of them, and they feel bad, or that's what they claim, right? And they feel bad, and then they give some gifts to the islanders. It was seen that the islanders were already distrusting, right? So they gathered, but now they kept their distance. They didn't come close to the Dutch again. At some point, some chiefs ordered the islanders to leave some food, some more gifts, chickens and stuff for the Dutch, and that's what they did, like an offering. Okay, please don't kill us, right? Okay, and they left the stuff there, and then they run away. Right, they ran. So the Dutch realized that something, and the islanders were gathering in bigger and bigger groups, but always keeping their distance. And that's when the Dutch said, okay, maybe, yeah, this is it, right? So they just grabbed everything. They grabbed the gifts. They left the Haarlem cloth, and then they left, right? They went back to the ships. That's when the African galley, which was the fastest ship, lost an anchor and almost wrecks here. And later, that African galley would shipwreck in the Tuamotu Islands in Takapoto, right? So I always say that's the curse of the island. And it happened also to the Spanish expedition. It happened to Captain Cook, and it happened to La Perouse, right?
Wow.
So, well, the main consequence of this visit, besides the fact that it broke the cycle, in terms of consequences for the rest of the world, not for the island, for the rest of the world, it's that they started going with the mystery of the Moai and how they were transported. Just like Captain Cook started with the whole collapse modern myth, Roggeveen started with okay, how the hell did they transport these statues, right, without trees? Because that's in the account of the Dutch. It's we saw these massive statues, but we cannot figure out how they were able to move them, right? Because they are naked. They don't seem to have very systems with, I don't know, they don't have animals. They don't have oxen. They don't have elephants. They don't have whatever, right? So they were wondering. They are the first ones that start wondering how those statues were moved. So that's, I think, to the outside world, the main lasting discussion that the Dutch expedition started.
And I think that's a great way to think about it. I mean, even in archaeology, we're still trying to answer those questions about, collapse and environmental degradation, and was it anthropogenic, or how many books do we both have read about how were the Moais transported? I'm sure in your work as a cultural agent and as a tour guide and as an educator, that's probably the most common question that we receive. The first one is, how are the statues carved and moved? And the second is, are Rapa Nui people still alive? So it's really an honor. It's really an honor to have that conversation with you. So for everyone listening, please know that the Rapa Nui people are alive and well. They've been surviving through this pandemic, with basically the last commercial flight leaving the 23rd of March of 2020. And they've done a remarkable job to get more in place for when the island eventually opens up. So I'm very much looking to get back and to see you and Nat and the family and the island and the sites. And so I also hope you can maybe get off and go, because we know that this summer there is the 10th Easter Island and Pacific conference, international conference that's held in the Netherlands in Leiden. So I'm hoping that you get to go out there, and it'll be like the old saying, you know, the Grant McCall, where you had the world on Rapa Nui, and now we have Rapa Nui in the world. And you'll be able to go there and maybe not have shots fired, but maybe you could go there and you know, and enjoy that time with us there, because we always know and value your input. Would you finish up with maybe 2 or 3 points of emphasis about today's entire discussion that the outside world should really know about this this contact and this 300 years since contact?
Well, yeah, basically the Dutch expedition, let's say it's something that puts the island in the world, right? As part of the world, as a larger world. The island, I like to think of the history of the island as being divided in 3 periods. A period of a Polynesian context. When this island was settled, it was part of a larger thing, which is southeastern Polynesia. Okay, it's there. And then period of isolation. We can obviously always discuss how long was each one, right? It can be a long discussion. But then a period of isolation of several centuries in which the island had no contact with anyone, no Polynesia, no one else, no South America, of course, and no Europe or any other place. So long period of isolation, which is the period in which the island became specialized, in which the island became unique, even though it's a Polynesian culture with a Polynesian language, with Polynesian customs. It's very specialized, it's very unique, even considering the Eastern Polynesian context. So that's the period when the island became unique and very different from everything else. And then the period which starts with the arrival of the first Europeans. And that's a period that, even though all these first European visits are intermittent, right? 1722, 1770, 1774, 1786. First 4 powers were Dutch, Spanish, British, French. None of them returned because, okay, the island was not, they were not interested in colonizing a place like this island. And some people claim that we were very lucky because of that, right? The fact that the island did not have a gold mine or something, that we were very lucky because of that. Could be, I don't know, but that's one of the things. So, and afterwards, it becomes a much more standardized contact with the outside world. When the whalers were coming, when it's mostly whalers after that, and whalers pass, they get supplies, the islanders give them stuff, and they get stuff in exchange from the whalers, and no one lands on this island. It's the islanders that go out there, and the islanders force the trade into what they want. So almost, if you check all the reports from the 1800s until the 1860s, 95% of them, of the contact, occurs out there in the sea, in the ships, and no one's allowed to land. Does it have to do with the bloodshed, with the islanders knowing the power of guns, right? And okay, let's do it out there, and we keep our families safe out in the island, and we go out there to the Aito, the brave ones go out there for the trading, right? So, and the other thing is that the island started or was forced to cope with things that came with these visitors, and that is diseases, right? And that's the real collapse of the island, and that's when really these diseases started changing the way things work for Rapa Nui, and a population that was quite specialized, with chiefs, with leaders, experts in each and every single task for the community. It worked like a clockwork, right? Every person was essential for the functioning of the community. But now when you lose someone, when someone dies, or where someone's sick with a fever for 2 weeks, cannot work, who's going to do that job? Someone else needs to do that. So in that case, the society of ultra specialization no longer works. So the islanders started to switch gradually into a society of generalists. You are better, you're more valuable if you know how to do different things. The more things you know how to do, all the better, because you can always, okay, take the place of someone else that cannot work or someone else that dies. Okay, we have to make the fire, we have to build a house, we need to carry rocks, we need to chant the prayers, we need to go fishing, we need to build nets for fishing, we need to make fish hooks. All of these things. If one person knows how to do all of these things, even if it's not as good as a specialist, you're more valuable. And you know that the Rapa Nui people, the older Rapa Nui people, let's say people born in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, they are this kind of people. They built their own houses, they fix their own cars, they speak 3-4 languages, they play all sorts of musical instruments, they can sing, they can dance, they can do everything, right? So that's the society that started to be shaped as a result of these contacts, right? So I would finish with that reflection on how the impact of it's not all negative. We know that it's quite common now to paint it as a people might be tempted to paint it as a horrific beginning and so on, and the suffering of the Rapa Nui people. But the Rapa Nui people are not much about claiming to be victims. Rapa Nui people think they are the center of the world. So I think that we have to keep all of these things into a perspective of, okay, these were tough times, but tough times make tough people, right? So I think that's how the Rapa Nui people would like to see it.
Outstanding. CMP, always a pleasure. I hope we can continue to do this. Maybe if you're listening out there and you'd like to hear about a topic, why don't you mark it in the comment section and just put a topic for us. And we'll try to continue to do this and get these little information sessions out. I would just like to end always by saying thank you to the traditional owners of Rapa Nui, the ancestral folks that we stand on their shoulders of greatness. And I'm honored to always have my discussions with you, and I've learned a lot through our time together and our collaboration. So I hope that continues. So I'll just say on my end, thank you so much. Everyone out there, take care of yourselves. CMP, always a pleasure. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime. Yorana koe.
Yorana koe.